right, great. So just to formally start, I would like to welcome everybody to our August Feeling the Pulse session. My name's Murray Benton and I work here with Q Shelter in the Community Housing Futures Program Delivery Team. So many of you may already know that these monthly sessions are a regular learning exchange for community housing providers with a real focus on investment and growth activities as per our program's purpose. We also include briefings and information around the Community Housing Futures Program when we can. And these sessions are ongoing opportunities to exchange information and discuss certain industry challenges or successes, and also allows us to hear from certain relevant guest speakers and presenters throughout the year. So I do have just some quick housekeeping like per usual. So we are recording this session for distribution purposes. So if you have any questions, feel free to please pop them in the chat. It is being moderated. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Maya from our Q Shelter team that's supporting us during this call today. And also we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So feel free to ask any questions to myself, Maya, or also our guest presenter. We do love seeing faces, and Emil led the way this at the start of the session with Tio. But please, if you can, keep your cameras on towards the end because we'd love to be able to connect with you. So I start by proudly acknowledging the traditional owners and caretakers of the various lands in which we're all dialing in from for today's session. For me, I'm in beautiful Meanjin country here in Brisbane, acknowledging the traditional owners and caretakers, the Turrbal and Yagara people. And I really want to extend that respect to any elders past and present, and also that is extended to any First Nations brothers or sisters and allies that are here with us today during this call. If you can, I'd love to see, or we would love to see where you're dialing in from. So if you can in the function chat, please feel free to pop that in there as well. And one thing I should have said during the last slide too, if you have any audio issues or any challenges with our visuals, please just let us know by raising your digital hand or popping that in the chat as well. So the Community Housing Futures Program, which some of you will have heard this a few times now, the Feeling the Pulse sessions that we're hosting are originally Q Shelters. Now, Q Shelter is the auspice organisation for this program in close partnership with our peak partners in Queensland Government. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Queensland are a non-government peak body that work together with members and partners to eliminate the disparities in housing experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Queensland. And I just want to acknowledge Neil Wilmot as their Chief Executive Officer. Community Housing Industry Association, which everybody in this call will be familiar with as well, is an independent industry body representing community housing organisations. And secondly, I'd like to acknowledge Anne-Marie Callender, who's also a part of the governance structure of this program as their executive officer. And then Fiona Cornelia, who is the Chief Executive Officer here at Q Shelter, which is a peak body working to influence solutions to housing need and homelessness across an array of influence and sector support mechanisms. Now, we don't have a great deal in terms of an update for Community Housing Futures at this stage. It is business as usual, but one thing that was really important that we wanted to stress during this call is many of you may be aware that Community Housing Futures commenced back in January 2023 with a 2-year funding commitment from Queensland Government. Now, future funding hasn't yet been confirmed still. However, our governance committee has agreed to progress consultation with community housing organisations across our industry to investigate what priorities the Community Housing Futures program should consider if we do receive future funding. And there's a few key components that I wanted to outline during this session for you. So at the moment, we're developing a discussion paper, which will collate any ideas specifically for capacity building support is kind of the focus. And those elements have been pulled from standing and ongoing mechanisms throughout the last sort of year and a half to inform that. And then we'll be convening one face-to-face workshop and 2 online workshops as well, I guess to further seek what industry believes those priorities will be. We don't expect that this will be the only opportunities that we create by any stretch for our program members and also the wider industry. However, until future funding is attained, we think this is a really good step to be able to start collecting what that could look like. Please reach out to us if you'd like to know any more about these these times and sessions. You can see there on this presentation that kind of gives you a bit of a quick snapshot of what the sessions will be targeted at and when. And you can also jump onto Eventbrite through our website. There's a link there, or reach out to us in terms of registering for those sessions. So straight over to our guest presenter, Renee. Now, I want everybody to strap in because I'm going to go through a bit of a bio about Renee, but I thought it was really important as Renee's quite an impressive individual, and I'm pretty excited to be able to have her time today. And so Renee is a social and affordable housing industry professional with over 20 years experience in policy, program and operations. Renee has worked for the New South Wales Government Office of Community Housing and Centre of Affordable Housing, UK Department of Communities and Local Government, local governments in Sydney and also London, as well as the largest not-for-profit community housing provider in Sydney, which is St George Community Housing. So Renee now runs her own consultancy service called Framework Consulting. But back during her time with St George Community Housing, Renee led business development projects to increase the supply of social and affordable housing under management by almost 1/3. So while working for the New South Wales government, Renee delivered key strategic reforms to grow the not-for-profit community housing industry, including the transfer and ownership for 6,000 social housing assets at no cost to community housing providers, to provide an asset base to leverage debt finance for fund an additional 1,600 affordable housing homes. She also was responsible for managing the tendering and contracting of capital grant funding programs for affordable housing delivered by community housing providers with the state-based administration for NRAS. And lastly, while at St George Community Housing, we wanted to highlight that she led the business development projects to increase the supply of social and affordable housing under management by almost 1/3. This included leading the successful proposal under the New South Wales Government Social and Affordable Housing Fund Phase 1, being a similar model to the Housing Australia Future Fund to support and deliver 250 new social and affordable homes. So with all of that to consider, Renee, I will stop sharing and give you an opportunity to share your presentation, and would really like to hand over to you.
Thanks, Murray, and hi, everyone. I can see there's quite a lot of people on the call. I am going to share a presentation, so I won't be able to see everyone's faces. But if you do have a question during the presentation, I'm actually happy to take it. So it just breaks up me talking. So if you want to just put it in the chat, and Maya will sort of stop me and let me know a question's there, and we can have a little bit of a conversation about your question, but also we can have a conversation at the end of the presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today is how you can better prepare in between funding rounds. Oh, I'm screen sharing, but not moving my slides. Okay, cool. Yeah, so how can you better prepare your business for a future funding round, noting that there's nothing necessarily live right now. I think the Quick Starts Queensland grants may or may not have future funding rounds. We think that the Housing Australia Future Fund will have a second round, but we do know that the first round was fairly oversubscribed. So we don't know what's on the horizon, but it is likely there'll be something either at a state or federal level. So this is really a conversation around the things that you can do, whether you are already an experienced sort of tender submitter and winner, or if this is something that is an emerging business opportunity for you. Probably more to learn for those who haven't submitted anything in the past, but are hopefully something useful to take home for you to think about and talk about with your colleagues. So really, we'll just start off talking about how you build your understanding of the likely funding opportunities on the horizon. And there's actually quite a lot you can do in this space, particularly if this is a new area of business, because there's actually quite a lot of information out there in the market about previous funding rounds, successful projects, as well as being able to talk to colleagues about what you can learn from their experiences, although your competitors, most community housing colleagues are still willing to share, maybe not the exact number that they bid, but particularly around their experiences. So it's really like understanding what may be in the marketplace, what's recently been in the marketplace in terms of state and federal government funding programs. Sometimes, and I know this is the case in Queensland, that local councils may also dip their toes in the water, but traditionally it's been the space of state and government funding, federal government funding programs. So understanding what is the outcome government is looking for from those programs, the priority locations and the target tenant groups are really important understanding of how you might position your business if a future funding, or when a future funding opportunity arises. Understanding the type of funding that is available is also really important because it becomes about your risk appetite to take on what government is offering, because generally government is looking for you to put in a contribution as well, and there is a sharing of risk across a funding contract. So understanding what that is and what the offer is really an important part of firming up whether actually you'd be interested in positioning yourself or submitting a tender in a future funding round. So I'll talk about in a moment about the different types of things that are sort of predominant in the marketplace at the moment, but it is sort of, the more traditional capital funding grant, an availability payment, which is sort of a bit more all of the rage now. So that is what basically the Housing Australia Future Fund facility is. A lot of state governments are also exploring long-term leases, so sort of 49-year leases, and potentially some funding associated with that. And then obviously Housing Australia also offers low-cost financing. So when you're looking at the different funding opportunities that have just been or might be in the market, it's also important to understand what's expected of the provider. And increasingly, there is an expectation that, that a provider is bringing equity, so either sort of retained surpluses or land, or bringing debt finance that you'll be repaying with the surplus rental income from the project. So it's really going to be an important part of understanding whether you can position yourself well in a future funding round. And then the other thing that's really important to understand, and perhaps not as exciting and maybe a little bit more dry, is understanding the contracting framework, because really this is what you'll have to deliver against. And increasingly the contracts are 25-year, 45, 49 years. So they're quite long-term contracts that may be in place well after you are no longer in the business that you're currently working for. So you actually have to make, really important decisions around future commitments for your business. So understanding what the restrictions and requirements are, the risk allocation, the non-delivery clause. Happens if you can't deliver the project that you thought you could fund with the money that you receive. A very important one, and an important one for your board to understand as well. And also the ongoing reporting and compliance regime. For some tenders that I've seen or worked on, the requirements around reporting have been so big that you've actually had to hire like another half a person. So it's a really important component of understanding of like not just the funding that you're going to receive for the tender, but also how you're going to manage the contract on an ongoing basis. So we don't have a huge amount of time to go into the different funding types. Traditionally, affordable housing funding or social and affordable housing funding in different jurisdictions in Australia was a capital grant upfront, paid at different intervals over the project delivery. And it was a fairly standard contract. And then there may have been some sort of interest or mortgage on title to ensure that the project is retained for a long period of time for social and affordable housing tenants. It seems quite standard and actually quite simple in comparison to a lot of the contracting frameworks that are emerging. Something like the Quick Starts grant in Queensland, and every state and territory that has actually had a funding program has started off with a capital grants program. A lot of them expect, and the same for the Quick Starts Queensland, that you are leveraging something to bring to the party. So you're using the surplus rental income from the project or an equity contribution or land. So you're making a part contribution, and often in a sort of a social housing program, if you're bringing a contribution, you can also use that for affordable housing. So you've got a slightly higher income stream. So the availability payments is a little bit more popular now. So it started off in New South Wales with the Social and Affordable Housing Fund. Victoria adopted a similar model, and then Housing Australia have adopted a very similar model to the Social and Affordable Housing Fund in New South Wales for their Housing Australia Future Fund. And it basically means, and I think all of the programs have used this time frame of 25 years. Over 25 years, you receive a regular payment to help fund the debt that you've generally you would have had to borrow money, the debt that you've borrowed to build or acquire a new social and affordable housing supply. So you're getting a monthly payment that assists with the surplus rental income stream that you have off the project to pay back the debt over the 25 years. So this is quite an interesting one. So there's actually then at the end of the 25 years, there's no actual responsibility to continue to house the tenants, and different programs have different sort of end of term clauses in this space. So it's sort of the money is being used to purchase accommodation rather than, from a government perspective, rather than actually build housing, because it's the provider that actually owns the housing, and there is no like long-term registered interest on title. So it's actually the availability payment is actually just making sure the accommodation is available for the term of the contract, which is 25 years. And then I mentioned before long-term leases. So this is something the Victorian government, I think, started. So a 49-year long-term lease, and it may be something that the Queensland government picks up as well, of state government, older, aging public housing assets, redeveloped using the land, developing it at a higher density of social and affordable, sometimes market housing, and using a combination of sort of sales, debt finance, and potentially some other grant funding to fund the construction costs. So that's something that the New South Wales government is actually starting to deliver as well. So it may be a model we see more broadly across. So I just thought it was worth mentioning, because I'm not sure what the Queensland government is thinking in this space. So if you're thinking about how you might actually prepare and position your organisation in between funding rounds, if you've already been successful or put in for a number of funding rounds, you may have already answered these questions and you're quite far along your sort of strategic planning growth journey. But if this is something new to you, some of the things I would very much recommend you do, or you start doing with your board, is sort of factoring and aligning your growth planning to your strategic planning cycle, so you have a real clear understanding of what your appetite is for growth, the type of housing projects, locations you'd be interested in if the opportunity arose, because really sometimes the decisions you make about what you don't do can be more important about you decide what you will do, because really it's about making sure your decisions are aligned to your future strategic directions. It's part of that because you can understand what's in the marketplace in terms of different funding opportunities, understanding what your risk appetite might be as a business to take on debt, to offer up an equity payment, to offer up a land payment, offer up land that you may already have, to really understand what kind of risk profile you'd be willing to take, because there is risk associated with new supply acquisitions, even if you're not having to do the construction, turnkey developments, and then obviously construction projects have a whole set of more risks that you need to be really across and understand how you might mitigate and manage them and tolerate those risks if this is a new area of business that you're stepping into. Now, the last one here is around board support, and I was talking about this recently in another session, and I think you can't underestimate the importance of bringing your board on the journey if they're not already understanding it, of where you might be heading, and making sure you bring them along at different points, having a real clear understanding of what they're going to approve you to progress as growth projects, preparing them for upcoming types of tenders that may be available, getting different experts in to brief your board so they can understand how a risk that you're your business's risk profile might change if you start to move into acquisitions, turnkey purchases, and new construction. So it really is an important part of the journey, because I have seen a number of providers spend a lot of time and a lot of money on proposals and approaches for it to go to the board before it gets submitted and for it to not be approved. So it might seem sort of quite logical, but it is a really important part of just bringing them on the journey and making sure you're also got the right skills on your board as your business changes and you grow a particular part of your business, whether it's acquisitions or new supply. And generally, I think you'll find that there are quite a lot of interested, skilled experts out there looking to join boards, but at making sure that your board skill set reflects this area of business is also something to think about as you plan out where you might go next. So one of the things to think about in your growth planning considerations is you don't necessarily have to have a growth plan per se, but an understanding of the different aspects. So you can be really clear when you tender or grant opportunities come up, what might be something that you'd actually be interested in investing in and pursuing. So being really honest about where your current capacity and capability is, whether it's the financial capability or capacity internally to manage different projects or even to manage a tender submission. Understanding of the funding models that you'd be interested in pursuing and the different types of contracting frameworks that sit with that. Understanding of the type of procurement models that you'd also be looking at. A number of providers, when I started working, they started doing their first sort of developments in New South Wales in sort of 2008, 9. They started off doing acquisitions and upgrades and turnkey projects as they dipped their toe into borrowing money to deliver new supply, and then they've moved into having their own new supply teams internally. So it's sort of a bit more of a journey, but I sit on a board that actually has, they had a bit of land and just decided to go for it with a new construction project. So really understanding, the pros and cons of the different models of procurement, and sometimes different tendering opportunities restrict which kind of model you can do. But a lot of them at the moment have an opportunity to do acquisition and upgrade as long as you're significantly increasing the new supply on the site. Turnkey projects, which is essentially you're purchasing a building at the end of a new building at the end of its completion, or sort of a units in a building at the end of the completion, or a construction project where you're going from site acquisition through planning to the development phase and handover. Increasingly, a lot of tenders are looking for specialized tenant cohorts, particularly around women with children experiencing domestic and family violence. So understand whether that's something that you're interested in or you could actually do as a component of a project. So really understanding if that's a service offering you can make in a tender is an important part of growth considerations as well. And of course, understanding the housing type that you'd be prepared to invest in: social, affordable, transitional, disability, and would you be prepared to manage market housing as part of a mixed tenure project? That's certainly something a number of governments are sort of facilitating as well. Understanding the base housing design requirements of the contracting agencies at Silver Livable standards. Do they have an expectation about a NATA's rating or a Green Star rating? Because certainly that's going to be part of your cost factoring. And then also locations. Are there certain areas that you're only going to work in? Makes sense. You've got a service delivery footprint. Are you prepared to go to new areas? If so, when, how big does the project need to be? All of those things are things you need to consider about in terms of your strategic growth planning. Business readiness. Now, again, we don't have a tender right out at the moment, but there are things that you can think about in this space. Keeping an opportunities log around different sites that meet your growth plan criteria, and understanding who's building what in your local market or the locations that you're interested in. building partnerships with local councils. You might be able to give land in a sort of a joint venture arrangement or another type of contracting structure. Builders and developers who have sites that they've acquired that may be something you could put into a tender, put an option in, which is basically sort of, securing a site, but on the basis that you'll secure funding through a tender process. Understanding your financial capability. Do you have cash reserves that you could offer up an equity contribution? Do you have some land that has redevelopment potential? All of these things can be done well before a tender comes out and really position you well in that space. So one of the things, and I think the Queensland government really understand this because they've invested in the Community Housing Futures program, is that it does take money to grow your business and understand where you need to be and where you can make the right decisions for investment. So I think it's also important to understand what you're prepared to invest in growing your business. Are you going to have an internal staff member that manages business development? Will you have the resources to have an internal staff member to do development management, or will you need to outsource it? There's plenty of different options out there. Do you have a suite of consultants that you trust, that you can draw on their expertise? Have you got the cash to actually do a land acquisition that meets your needs to be ready for a future round? Not all organisations can be in that position, but there can be some historical land, that a different organisation may have been gifted or owned. So have a look at those things. If you do have access to a site or land, do you have the capacity to progress to design and a development application? Because if you have all of that information, when it is a tender opportunity, you can demonstrate that you are able to deliver that project because you've actually progressed it to a certain point and all you need is the funding and financing. So it's certainly not a situation that everyone can be in, but it is, if you do have land and it is a site that's developable, if you can progress it, you're certainly going to be higher up the list of when you get ranked in a tender process of actual deliverability. Tender readiness. And so, look, this could be a whole day, but the things that you can do to get ready for the actual documents is being really clear about what your value proposition is. So what is the particular offer that you have to government? What can you offer? Is it a specialised service delivery? Is a local service offering? Are you going to be a great partner to government because you've been working with them for so long? What are the different things that, are really important, clear messages you need to emphasize in your tender? You can get that ready before. Draft collateral. Do you have case studies, KPIs and data series that can show your capacity and capability? You can actually get that together in a little bit of a bank of written content and information. You do always have to refine it, but it actually is just a great starting point to have that collateral in place. And then another way to get really, really tender ready is be really clear about the resources you have internally and external advisors to run a tender. Who will run it internally? Will you take someone offline? Do you have someone who can actually write a response that, is a skilled writer? All of those things you can think about before. And it just takes that, if you can get these things in place before the tender opens, it takes that first week of sort of like planning out of it, and you've given yourself an extra week or so in the tender process because you're ready. So each tender, unfortunately, is always different. Even if it's a second round, they always change something. So it's never an exact cut and paste from a previous tender, but there is certainly lots of things you can do to get ready in that space. The next one is my final slide, which is really a bit more of an exploration around your value proposition. Now, this is like a marketing term. And when I first heard it, I thought, oh, what is this? But actually, it is really quite helpful because it's the way of really getting and honing your key messages that you can weave throughout a tender response. And you can also back up with case studies, like data and all the different things. And it just sort of subtly is really clearly, succinctly says to government or whoever's assessing a tender, you know what you're doing. So it's like simple key messages that set out the benefit of your organization or the proposal. How do you differentiate yourself from, as a business, from other providers in the area? And it really just helps to tell a clear, connected story. And I would suggest this for all tenders, that you do refine it to meet the particular needs of the strategic objectives of each grant or tender that you're going for. So they're my sort of thoughts over, probably 15 years of working on tenders, either in government or for providers. And, currently I'm sitting on a tender panel for the New South Wales government. And it strikes me that, if you are prepared, it just becomes a lot easier to tell a really clear message story. And it makes it a lot easier for the tender assessors to go, yeah, let's put that one through. So I think, there's my tips and tricks for tenders and preparation, and I'm just happy to answer any questions. So I'll stop sharing so I can see some faces if there are anyone brave enough to take off their video.
It's great. Thank you, Renee. We'll just sort of wait to see if anybody wants to pop their hand up or jump in, but I guess I'm happy to maybe just kick one off, and it might be, I don't know, a bit more of a simpler question, or it might not be. But I guess coming back to, in terms of investing, how much does an organization need to invest in growth? And obviously this will depend, subject to the organization size and the potential project or goal. But if I was a small CHP, as a starting point, what would your advice or initial thoughts be?
Yeah, look, I think that's a good question. So I was doing the training recently, and someone was like, oh, they've got a whole team as an organization. They've got a whole team of commercial team and investors, and they've got head of origination, all those sort of things. And that you really can't have that as an organization until you're in the 5,000 plus properties, because it's just very hard to sustain. So I just think you need to understand about, get some trusted advisors, bring them in when you need them, but do understand that you do need to invest in growth. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult in operational businesses, which is basically what community housing providers are. You're so busy running your business, the show, responding to tenants, that it's very difficult to focus on growth initiatives unless you have dedicated resources for that. So I don't have a figure because each of the tenders sometimes require more and more things that you need to invest in, but it does require a level of investment. And I do think you do reap the rewards if you do invest, where you're investing strategically aligned to what your growth objectives are.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Does anybody else on the call? Oh, sorry, Renee, jump back in.
You also don't want to put too much pressure on your existing team. Like, tenders are very stressful. So if you're expecting it to be done within existing resources, you're going to get burnout, which is going to impact your other business, your day-to-day business. So I think it is like just a recognition that you do need to invest. Otherwise, it just puts a lot of pressure on your existing team. Sorry, Mo.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Brave question.
Yeah, I have a question. From your experience sitting on the panel and checking all of the different kinds of documents CHPs are submitting, what are the most common mistakes or gaps of information that they forget to attach to their applications?
Yeah, I think probably there's three things. My most noted one is not actually answering the question. So really understanding what they're asking for you. Like, I'm doing this one currently, and the government's asked for targets, tenant targets, and most of them are like, well, whatever you want. But no, they've asked you for targets. So, like, what is the question? And you need to answer it. The second is, and it depends on where you are in a tender cycle, if you're just doing an expression of interest, it's okay to talk about what you currently do as general, like, this is what we do, this is how we do it. But if it's like, if you're into a particular project or site, or if you're into sort of a request for proposal stages, they're actually asking what you're going to do. So what are you doing for this particular site? What are the partnerships you're going to have in place? Who are you going to house? Not generic stuff, because that's that's not enough information. So sometimes, and also the third is, how do you prove what you say? What's your proof point around it? I think, you've got expert advisors sitting on panels looking at things so they can read between the lines of what you say. Like, you can say something very nice, like, we're amazing at what we do, but what's your proof around it? Where's your statistics? If you don't have data, do you have a case study? How do you prove what you're saying? And like, it's just surprising how often, like, that's not in place, even for very experienced organizations.
Thank you.
Would you, Renee, with your experience, I guess just specifically for Queensland, the slide that where you talked about business readiness, I guess, and in terms of preparing for tender processes and pursuing those different opportunities, do you have any reflections on the current sort of landscape or sort of where organisations sit in terms of, are you finding that a lot of organisations and smaller organisations are really needing to define that business readiness component? And I mean, obviously, Community Housing Futures, we've had a growth readiness program, let's say, within our sort of program deliverables, which was, quite a great hit and something we've identified is really critical, especially for the smaller CHPs here. But in terms of that business readiness component within this presentation, is there any reflections or anything? I guess I'm more targeting this question for a bit of advice for any smaller CHPs that might be here or watch this later.
Well, I think, the interesting thing is, say you look at your Quick Starts grant round, is the government has left all those documents on the website. So if you didn't go in a previous round, you can actually look at all those documents. Granted, they may change if there's a future round, but generally governments build on things, even if they call it something else, there's elements of different things there. So if you are not sure whether you want to be involved in that, but like, this is all the documentation is there. There's actually, like, there's web tutorials on there where they talked about, the market readiness. So there's actually a lot of information out there. So if you didn't go into Quick Starts round 2, there's actually a lot of information to decide whether you would if there was a 3. So get out there, like, have a look at that, summarize that for your CEO, have a discussion with your board, get an expert, a lawyer in to advise you where the risks might lie, like, talk to your lawyers, see if this is something you'd be interested in. Because when it comes out, again, if there's a third round, you don't have a lot of time to sit there and think about that. You've just got to jump into it. But, you need to decide whether this is something that you'd be interested in. So take that opportunity now to understand, what your board's risk appetite is, and really see if this came out in a month. Well, you probably need a bit more time than that because you do need to land. But, if this was to come out again early next year, which is maybe the case because it came out early this year, are you going to be ready? And that's not always do those contracts just sit there on the website. That's actually quite, I don't see that often. So you're actually in a good position if you're not sure, or this is something you want to grow into, really understand it, get into that contract, try and understand what that might look like. Have a look at the media releases for all the sites that have already won money. You can see where they are. You can see what kind of mix they are. You can see the type of design, like, elements that they've included, so you can get a feel for what is a winning tender. Talk to a winning tenderer. They generally, other CHPs, I mean, they're not going to give you their commercial figures, but they're generally happy they love a tour, ask for a tour, like, they love giving them. So, get out there and try and understand what is a winning project.
Yeah, great. Not to put you on the spot, Emil, but I've seen you nodding and having a bit of a giggle once or twice with some of that stuff Renee was saying. Was there any reflections from you or anything that you wanted to throw in?
Oh no, well, love the plug for lawyers. So, but yes,
I thought
no,
that's what I was hunting for.
I think I definitely agree. Well, talking to a few providers along the way when you're in the midst of a tender process, trying to go through all the legal docs is not what anybody wants to do, nor is it what people have the time for. So trying to get those things done ahead of time is definitely, I think, a good thing to do.
Yeah, great.
Are you a lawyer, Emil? Is that where you? Yeah. If you've got a local trusted lawyer, or you don't have a lawyer that sits in this space, I do recommend. I think boards really appreciate getting different experts to come in and brief them as part of understanding what's there, so they can just question those things, even within when you're in the tender round. That's a good idea too. But actually, if you've got the time to think about and prepare, get a lawyer in to have a session around what are the different risks and contracting risks, because you are signing a 25-year contract or a 49-year contract, and no one is going to be around, but you have to think about the future of your organization and what they're going to be committed to.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Renee, and thank you for making the time. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment. We really appreciate you giving us this time, especially. So Renee was one of the people involved in our property development masterclass with PCA. Was one of our expert guests, and so just rounding off from that as well, it was a really great few days to spend with some CHPs here across Queensland. So really appreciate your time there and also here today. People have made 3 minutes back in their day. And so just on a last point, Renee, are you happy for and comfortable for me or our team to send out this presentation slides from today?
There's all of those things. Hopefully you can come back and reflect on them, and please.
Yeah, great. And obviously your details will be a part of that. And so you're happy for people, if they've got any questions, they can reach out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. Well, really good to connect with everybody again. And thanks so much for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Renee. And Murray.